Most people think that enlightenment is about becoming peaceful. That's not what makes it terrifying. What makes it terrifying is if enlightenment is real, then the person you think is suffering right now may not actually exist. And if that sounds insane, good. Because at the moment this starts to make sense, your entire life changes. Not your personality, your actual relationship to pain, fear, loneliness, anxiety, death, addiction, and suffering itself. Because what if the reason you overthink isn't because your mind is broken, but because you spent your whole life identifying as something you never actually were? Look carefully at your experience right now. Thoughts are appearing, sensations are appearing, emotions are appearing, but where exactly is the one they are appearing to? Not conceptually or philosophically, right now. Can you actually find a separate you anywhere? Because this is where enlightenment stops being spiritual philosophy and starts becoming existential dynamite. What they don't realize is that genuine awakening destroys the psychological structure in which suffering depends on. And once that structure collapses, some of the things that people spend their entire lives fighting simply stop functioning the same way. Boredom and stress change, fear changes, even death changes. But here's the part nobody tells you. You don't actually get these benefits by improving yourself. You get them by realizing the self you're trying to improve may itself be the illusion, and that's the catch. But the mind hates hearing this because the mind wants enlightenment to be an achievement for me. But the deeper that this goes, the more uncomfortable the question becomes. What if the me chasing enlightenment is just another thought appearing by itself? Think about anxiety for a second. Anxiety always sounds personal. My future, my life, my problems, my failure. But notice something strange. The entire experience of anxiety is made out of thoughts, sensations, and mental images appearing automatically. You don't choose the next anxious thought before it appears. You don't manufacture fear manually. It simply just arrives. And then another thought appears claiming ownership of it. This is happening to me. But where is this me? You need to look directly. Can you find an actual entity, or can you only find more thoughts about an entity? Because if the self is mostly just a mental construction, then suffering begins collapsing at the exact point identification collapses. That's why enlightenment radically changes stress. Stress depends on psychological ownership. It depends on the belief that there is a separate person inside the body carrying life like a burden. But what happens when that separate center starts disappearing? Life still happens, the body still moves, thoughts still appear, but psychologically the weight changes because there's no longer the same internal fiction claiming ownership over every experience. And this starts affecting everything. Overthinking begins breaking apart because overthinking depends on a thinker. Look at your thoughts carefully. Did you create the next one? Can you predict the next thought before it appears? No. Thoughts simply emerge. But then another thought appears afterward, pretending to be the author, and that's the illusion. The mind narrates ownership after the fact. And once this becomes obvious through direct experience, something shocking happens. The compulsive need to mentally control reality starts weakening, not because you become positive, but because the controller itself cannot actually be found. Now, here where this gets even stranger. Most emotional suffering isn't caused by emotion itself, it's caused by identification. Anger hurts because it becomes my anger, so does depression and fear. It becomes my fear. But remove the psychological owner, and emotions start behaving more like weather patterns moving through open space. Temporary, impersonal, not identity. This is why many deeply awakened people describe an immunity to hefty emotional suffering. Not numbness or suppression, but freedom from psychological entanglement. Anger and sadness and pain can all still arise, but there's no longer the same solid character at the center claiming this is happening to me. And once identification weakens, addiction starts changing too, because addiction is usually an attempt to escape psychological discomfort. But if the self starts dissolving, the addictive substance starts losing fuel. Think about how many addictions are just distractions from yourself. Scrolling, validation, status, achievement, constant simulation. Why? Because silence focuses you to confront the uncomfortable feeling of being you, but enlightenment attacks the problem at the root. It asks a terrifying question: what if the self you're trying to escape never actually existed as a separate entity to begin with? And suddenly loneliness changes too, because loneliness depends on separation and feeling like a disconnected fragment trapped inside a body looking out at a world over there. But look at your direct experience. Right now, where exactly do you end and experience begin? Can you actually find that boundary, or is there simply experience happening? Sight, sound, sensation, thought, awareness appearing all at once without a visible center. This is why awakening can produce overwhelming feelings of connection, love, and freedom, not because reality has changed, but because the illusion of separation starts collapsing. And when separation collapses, external validation starts losing its grip. Think about how exhausting it is to maintain your identity all day, to be respected enough, interesting enough, enough for who? Well, I mean, that's the real question. Who exactly is the one incomplete? Find the one lacking, find the self that needs validation. Can you actually locate it? Or can you only find thoughts saying it exists? This is why enlightenment produces massive internal liberation, because the ego survives through psychological maintenance. Comparison and narrative, image, control, defense. But when the structure itself is seen through, life becomes radically lighter. And yes, this even affects the fear of death. Not because enlightenment gives comforting beliefs about the afterlife, actually the opposite. It removes the false assumption that there was ever a separate self inside the body able to die in the first place. Look carefully. Right now, what are you fundamentally? Are you truly the voice in your head? The body, the personality, the memories, thoughts appear, sensations, emotions, they all appear, but awareness itself remains. And here's the terrifying implication: if the separate self is only a mental construction, then death may not be the destruction of a self. It may be the destruction of an illusion. That's why enlightened people often stop fearing death in a normal way, because the thing they thought they were was never stable to begin with. But now we arrive at the biggest misunderstanding of all. People think enlightenment is about becoming permanently happy, and it is not. Enlightenment is not self-improvement, it's self-transcendence. But actually deeper than that, it's the recognition that the separate self was never there in the way you imagined. And once this is seen clearly enough, something shocking happens to ordinary suffering. Because suffering requires existence. Resistance requires ownership. Ownership requires identity. And identity begins collapsing under direct observation. But this is also why enlightenment is so rare, because everyone wants freedom until freedom starts costing them their entire identity. People want peace without losing the person, but the person is the tension. That's the paradox. The very thing seeking liberation is the thing enlightenment exposes as illusory, which means the final barrier isn't suffering, it's the fear of disappearing. And honestly, that fear makes sense, because from the ego's perspective, enlightenment feels like death. Not physical, but psychological death, the collapse of the imagined center, the end of me. But here's the strange part: when people actually begin awakening deeply, what then remains is an emptiness, relief. Because maintaining a separate self is exhausting, constantly defending an identity, constantly protecting an image, constantly fighting reality. constantly trying to become enough. And suddenly all of this starts loosening, not because you became superhuman, but because the illusion carrying the burden started to dissolve. And what remains underneath that burden is something unbelievably ordinary. It's this, just this, experience happening without a central owner, without a thinker behind thought, without a separate self-controlling existence, just awareness. Already here, before every thought, during every emotion, after every fear. Completely untouched by the story of me. And the craziest part is that this may be the only thing you've truly been searching for your entire life. Not success or status or endless pleasure, but relief from being a separate psychological self. Which means enlightenment may not give you something new at all, it may just reveal what has always been there the entire time before the mind invented a person to suffer. You were never the voice in your head trying to become free. You were the awareness in which that voice appeared, struggled, searched, panicked, and disappeared.